Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show of the week, although we have an extra on Sunday when we're discussing the creation of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, but that's not till Sunday. So we're talking about the 3rd Infantry Division. They'd already battled their way through North Africa, Salerno, Anzio, but they then set sail for southern France. John McManus returns to expand on their participation, arguably their most forgotten campaign, but we've just been chatting. It's going to go all over the place in true kind of James Holland, Al Murray, John McManus, Woody fashion. It's going to veer over doctrine and theaters and resources and probably a little bit about logistics. But I'll bring John in now. Good afternoon, sir. Are we well?
Doing great. Always great to be with you, Woody. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the fact that there's a whole lot of shit going on in August and September 1944, and it's a lot to kind of juggle because and that's for us now to comprehend it, let alone to organize it as a president, prime minister, theater commander back then. I mean, you've got still fighting in Italy. You've got still things going on with logistics in the Mediterranean. You've got the creation of the 1st Allied Airborne Army for future endeavors as yet to be determined. You've got the south of France we're talking about. You've got Brittany. You've got the 3rd Army from Normandy racing towards Germany, all happening at the same time. As a historian, does it sometimes feel this period is a little bit kind of like herding cats?
Or juggling like 8 balls and figuring out exactly which one has priority, right? I mean, it's just, there's so much going on, and it's kind of exactly what we want. In the sense that we want these big mobile campaigns and a sense of movement and progress and all that, but be careful what we wish for, because now we've got operations on so many parts of our map in Western Europe that it becomes, of course, logistics are an issue and priority, and we end up with all these communications issues. And if we pull back the lens even farther, from an American perspective, I mean, this is just one theater of many globally, in which we also have we're approaching the climactic phase too. Peleliu is about to happen. New Guinea's wrapping up with Biak wrapping up. The Philippines are about to happen. On and on it could go. So, like you said, from a president and prime minister standpoint, it's really hard to imagine how anyone could even begin to manage this.
And it kind of excuses some of these people for maybe not having a full grasp of the situation. People like Alan Brooke and Marshall and all these others, kind of the amount of reports that must have been crossing their desks on a daily basis must have been insane. And this is before, agendas on their iPhones to kind of plan everything out. And they've got to somehow juggle, as you say, there are all these theaters, all these things. And yet you said something there that I think is very revealing. I think the logistics situation has not gone away. I think there's a sense of we're over the worst in the dark days of not being able to string one operation together of 41, 42 are kind of in the past, and production's cranking up, and the systems are kind of in place now. Think of the rail units set up in Normandy, and yet there's still this getting all the stuff from the USA, from the empire to the theaters of war. Is a little bit of complacency setting in a little bit with regards just the sense that, overlords behind us, we're pushing out of Normandy, that these things aren't quite so important now we've got the Germans on the run?
Well, I would call it over optimism, just sort of, I wrote a book called September Hope about Market Garden. It's hope that the Germans are about to be finished. And so the logistics were always really complicated and complex. The problem now is that we don't have the stuff. It's how do we get it to where it needs to be with all these fighting fronts and various points of our map here, and constantly on the move, and the transportation network being, either destroyed or in crisis, whatever it would be. I think that's the challenge now. And I think there's a tendency, I think, to figure that after Normandy, after Bagration, after the attempt on Hitler's life, and of course Germany's diplomatic position is absolutely catastrophic at this point when you consider, the countries are changing sides and all this. There's a temptation to think that Germany is about finished. And as I often point out, this is a generation of senior officers, at least on the Western Allied side, who had experienced November 1918, when the Kaiser's Germany really had suddenly collapsed. And I don't know that anybody had quite anticipated that going the way it did back then. And so I think they felt like maybe they were in the middle of a redo in 1944. So I see it as more maybe a little misplaced optimism rather than complacency.
Great Dominion says hope is not a strategy, which is a nice little way of summing it up. So we're here to talk about the 3rd Division. And I think when you were on last time, we were talking about their role in Italy. We'd done Salerno, we'd done North Africa. And not just yourself, but Truscott, for my money, one of the best commanders of World War II and highly rated. And he goes up one. He goes on one up to within the Corps, which happened in Italy. What impact did that have on the 3rd ID? I mean, in terms of leadership?
Yeah, so the 3rd ID was fortunate in that, they were losing an excellent leader and then they gained an excellent leader. Truscott obviously becomes commander of 6th Corps. He had been an absolutely outstanding division commander. A division was really too small a ballywhack for someone like him ultimately, and he's going to get an army command by the end of the war. Not many people can say that. But Major General John Iron Mike O'Daniel, I'm not quite saying he's in the same category as Truscott, but wow, he's pretty darn good. So if you're going to lose Truscott, the good news is you have a guy who is a lead from the front combat soldier who is incredibly aggressive, smart, dedicated to soldiers, understands modern warfare, I think, on many levels. He's going to have a lot of different jobs in the Army after this that point to how highly regarded he is on many levels. So O'Daniel, to me, is just a terrific replacement when you consider how they could have gone backwards. So, I guess I should also point out too, O'Daniel's inheriting a pretty darn good unit. Everybody knows my partiality to the 3rd ID and particularly the 7th Infantry Regiment, which to my way of thinking is, the best regiment in the United States Army, but I'm biased, obviously. So this is a pretty first-string unit to take over that has the right blend of combat and amphibious invasion experience, along with enough fresh blood to keep some willingness to fight there. And so I think it's a really good combination with O'Daniel and this particular division.
And it seems that along with perhaps the 1st Division further north, that they're one of the better divisions at kind of getting that recipe right of phasing in the new people, keeping the combat sprints there, and not having that divide between the new faces and the old guys. I mean, we've had people on talking about the methods to do that within the 1st Division. Some divisions seem better at it than others, but the 3rd, by this point, they've been having to phase in replacements for the last 2 years, haven't they? So I suppose they've got it sorted.
Yeah, they do. I mean, you have that kind of institutional memory with some of the staff officers who are there at the various levels, all the way up to Division HQ. You have that. You have combat commanders who have become staffers and vice versa. You have people who have, led troops earlier in the war, been wounded and come back. You've got new guys who have become veterans. The 3rd ID, by the time this war ends, is going to take the most casualties of any U.S. Army division in the war against Germany. I mean, and that doesn't mean they're bad. It means they're just in combat so many days. From November 8th, 1942 forward, and they will be, the most accomplished amphibious division, I would argue, right up there in our entire armed forces. They're going to make more amphibious landings than any Marine division, so I think by the time we get to August 15th, 1944, they certainly know how to launch invasions, because they've been there and done that a lot. And so they understand that. And of course, continental littoral operations with which they've been involved in Africa and Italy too.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the fact they are going to arrive August the 15th, a year before my dad was born. He was born on VJ Day. But before we kind of leave Italy behind, because we've spoken about that in the past, is that it does pull out some of the better units from Italy to the south of France in what some historians say is a kind of a bonus operation. It's nice to have, but we don't need it. It's not got the kind of the fate of the world hanging on it like Overlord did or Bagration for the Soviet. It's kind of we can do it, so we will do it, and it will draw German units away. But is it the case that by this point, by the beginning of sort of August, September, is the US, you realize you're the bigger players now. You don't have to kind of bow down as much as you did maybe a year and a half earlier to the British, to the Commonwealth. And it's like, well, we didn't really want to go to Italy anyway. It was never our thing. So we're kind of just taking our cream away to the south of France. Is there a little bit of that going on?
Well, I don't think there's any question. I mean, so it's not to cast any aspersions on the American units left behind in Italy. These are fine units, and I would say especially the 1st Armored Division and the 34th Infantry Division, so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, there's no question in my mind that this is the first string of the U.S. forces there. When you're talking about the 3rd ID being taken for this invasion, the 45th and the 36th Division, which of course have been in a heck of some difficult scraps in Italy. And it reflects that American strategic priority, and the French priority too, by the way, because the French First Army is part of this as well. It reflects the priority to, certainly to liberate France. But from a U.S. perspective, there's a couple things at work here. I mean, Eisenhower had always kind of envisioned a complementary invasion alongside Normandy. And of course, the Germans had been obsessed with that idea, thinking it was coming at Calais. Eisenhower envisioned it, obviously in South France and catching the Germans in a vice and all that. The second layer of it is, as you had sort of indicated, Woody, I mean, we've become the leading partner in the coalition at this point, and we are going to get what we want. And I think the American perspective is, well, the British got what they wanted with the Mediterranean strategy in 42 and 43. Now our time has arrived, and we believe the South France invasion is crucially important. Of course, this is very controversial. At the time, Churchill hates the idea, and it's controversial among some historians. I'm a bit of a defender of it, and I'll tell you why. To me, Italy had already proven itself as more or less a dead end. And if we really wanted to get serious about it, we were going to have to invest more combat power than what we had. And that probably means stripping it from Eisenhower's armies in France or maybe somewhere else. When we're talking about the logistical situation that we have on the Western Front, that Eisenhower is confronting, whether we like it or not, we really can't sustain operations with the ports we have on hand, especially when we're not opening up Antwerp the way we should in the fall of 1944. So in that context, Marseille and Toulon become crucially important to the actual even sustainment of our armies in the fall of 1944, much less any kind of forward momentum. So in that, maybe, I guess, admittedly short-term logistical standpoint versus the larger kind of diplomatic side of where we're meeting the Soviets in the Balkans and all that, okay, I get that. But in the first place, we've got to sustain our armies and continue our operations. Otherwise, we're not going to defeat Germany anyway. So I think it did make some sense on that level.
Yeah, and it's that, Andreas made the point a minute ago in the sidebar that the main goals in Italy have been achieved. We've got the airfields. Rome has been liberated. We're pushing up towards the Alps now. The terrain is going to get shittier. Fitting more divisions in isn't always a possibility. So, kind of leave those units there and just carry on that grind up there. I don't know that I would feel that way if I was one of the GIs or Tommies or Canadians in Italy, left to kind of push my way up over the Alps towards Austria. But that is where we are. The port, to just push back on the ports idea, just because I like being argumentative because we're friends, is that, but there's that same argument about the ports in Brittany. That's the same argument about getting Saint Malo and Brest and all that as well. How many fucking ports do we need? I mean, in August, September.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, we need Antwerp, really. I mean, I agree.
The one ports we do need is the one we're not going for. Yeah,
exactly. So, I mean, I couldn't agree more about the Brittany ports. I mean, to me, they're beside the point in a way. I understand why they may have wanted them. But I think Bradley's argument later on that he makes about worrying about one of the German units coming to attack our flanks, if we're advancing east, I think that's fatuous. But to me, the farther east the ports, the more valuable they're going to be, because obviously the proximity to where the front lines are. Now, obviously here in South France, we don't have that once we're up to the Vosges. Obviously, Marseille and Toulon are farther away, but we control that road net, and we haven't destroyed it in the way we've destroyed the road and transportation net in northern France. So, in my view, let's say we have Antwerp, Marseille, and Toulon operating in addition to what we already have. That's probably about what we need. And so, to answer your question, how many ports do we need? I would say mainly the biggies. And I think that's the tragedy of the whole campaign at this stage in Northwest Europe, is that we don't value Antwerp maybe the way we should have and could have. And I think we do pay some price for that.
Well, we can bring you back. We're doing a whole week or two about the Scheldt, Walker, and Antwerp later in the year, so we can have you back to grumble about that, along with everybody else who's going to grumble about that. And that's this idea of there's lots of things going on, not least of which is drawing Germans away, isn't it? However many struggles the Allies are facing to keep mounting operations in multiple areas, and it's the strain it's putting on the Allies, it's theoretically putting even more strain on the Germans, because they are having to move. They're at the position the Allies were 3 years earlier, is that if they move troops into one place to defend that more strongly, they have to take them away from somewhere else, or can't push them somewhere else. So that they're getting fewer options as the Allies are getting more options, even though it's bringing its own problems, if that doesn't sound paradoxical. But yeah, so let's get back to the actual landing in the south of France. So you've got, some pretty good units, the 36th, 45th, 3rd going in there, with a very experienced amphibious landing practice behind them. The reason we don't talk about it that much is it went pretty well, really, didn't it? Just give us a thumbnail sketch of the 3rd coming ashore down in the St Tropez area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's sort of like Apollo 12 versus Apollo 13, right? We're more fixated on 13 because that's the crisis, similar to Omaha Beach or whatever. But so this one seems anticlimactic compared to what we've dealt with in Normandy. But you know what? It's not exactly 100% walkover either. And the example I'd give you, within the 3rd ID, I mentioned the 7th Infantry Regiment, which is one of the 3 regiments of the division. August 15, 1944 is the deadliest day they experience in all of World War II. And the reason for that is that the waters were mined. And so that's probably the biggest peril you've got to your life as a soldier coming ashore that day, is the mined waters that might impact your landing craft, more so than like the, firing machine guns at you German defenders. We don't have quite as much of that, but it's also, there are clumps of resistance here. And so there are some parts, not necessarily of the beaches, but the inland areas we must have, the road net, some of the bridges and whatever, that are defended pretty well. The Germans, as you mentioned, Woody, we're putting them in crisis by all these operations. They're stretched very thin manpower, so it makes total sense to just kind of avalanche them that way. But there are still spots where we have to deal with Germans or German affiliated soldiers of some kind who are willing to fight. And so that makes this less than a walkover for the average U.S. soldier coming ashore. So the 3rd ID covers that, most of that from a division perspective, that western flank of the invasion area. I mean, you see the French commandos, of course. We have the airborne operations that are going to go on. But if you're in the 3rd ID, you really wouldn't have as much of flavor for the airborne operations as you would in the 36th, where the paratroopers were landing a little bit closer to you. So the 3rd ID's job really is to kind of secure and seal that entire western flank. And as you see, advance westward and begin to capture that road net that you're going to lead up to the Rhone Valley. And that was, by the way, that's kind of a redo of what you've done in Sicily, because the 3rd ID does pretty much the exact same kind of thing there. It is that entire western flank of what was, then under the command of George Patton and his 7th Army in Sicily. Now you've got more or less the same kind of mission here.
Yeah, very good point. And I suppose in terms of that, getting that balance right between aggression and holding a beachhead, I suppose that the Allies have been through all the permutations of that, Anzio, Salerno, Normandy, etc. So this one, they're going into this with this idea of don't get stuck, but don't go too far. So I suppose from that they got the balance right. The objectives are sort of sensible, sort of slightly ambitious without being stupidly ambitious, but they're not cautious. Would that sum it up? Kind of a balanced?
I think so. Yeah, I think they're very mature in their planning. Yeah. These 3 divisions all have amphibious combat experience. They're all really, really well led, and I think the French units behind them, pretty much the same. This is a really high quality Allied invasion force that goes on here, much less the airborne, obviously.
Yeah.
And you'll notice we don't have armored divisions here yet. We don't necessarily have to, in the sense that we've got attached armor, and we've got plenty of artillery, and we've got obviously the Navy. So I think that the planning for this is really good. I think they have a pretty solid sense of the intel picture. That 19th Army, the German 19th Army, which is defending southern France, is kind of a gutted formation on some levels. And so the main concern you've got is which units are the potent ones and are going to fight. There's plenty of guys who are going to surrender to you or run away. But there are enough who are going to fight. I mean, like, for instance, the battle patrol, the 7th Infantry, runs into a heck of a fight, on they invade, and and it points to the biggest issue you've got. A lot of the area is mined, and it shows what the Germans can do, even when they're not very good. The mines can cause a lot of casualties, and this is happening. And we've got a guy in the battle patrol named James Connor who becomes this, this one-man fighting machine to basically take the battle patrol's objective, which is more or less on that western flank of our invasion area that we simply have to have so follow-on forces can come on. And so you can kind of match that up with what somebody like Jimmy Montate does at Omaha Beach, and saying, we've simply got to hold this flank, otherwise the other guys landing here at Omaha Beach are going to be in crisis, or whoever, So there are some similarities here, I think, to what we've seen in Normandy. In terms of the ferocity of the fighting in some parts, though obviously not all.
Which leads me nicely to this idea of people asking the sidebar about the planning behind it. Because as you said there, it was something that was thought of by Eisenhower and others, months earlier. So it wasn't something they have an idea sitting around in a pub in Rome. It was already on the cards. But whereas some of the other amphibious ops were kind of written on the back of a cigarette packet in a matter of a weekend. So it falls somewhere between being planned very well and sort of not quite last minute, but the actual fine detail put in together. Is that a kind of a fair assessment?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I mean, it isn't quite as elaborate, obviously, as Normandy, which is just off the charts.
Yeah.
And it's not a shoestring-ish kind of thing like Salerno might, lends toward at least a little bit. No, it's in between, because it's supposed to have taken place earlier, but we couldn't because of the shipping, and of course you've had this high-level head of state fight over it, with Churchill really adamantly opposing it to the last minute almost. So you've had to deal with that. And Churchill, to his credit, I've always thought this is really neat. He, even though he's totally against this, once he realizes the winds are blowing against him, he decides, you know what, I may not be for this, but I want to make sure it succeeds, and I want to make sure that that I can do my part to make that happen. And so he is in the area, and he gets aboard a boat, and the boat skims around out there where a lot of the American troops are about to go in on their troop ships and their landing craft, and he makes sure to be seen. And so if you were a U.S. troop going in on August 15th, you would have had no idea that Churchill wasn't on board with this, and you might have been kind of excited to see this old man, buzzing around out there, waving at you with his famous cigar or whatever. Churchill at least put on that good, loyal soldier command face, and I really have always felt that that's to his credit, even though he didn't want this thing to happen at all, and he argued against it the rest of his life, of course, too, as we know.
And do you think that benefited a unit like the 3rd Division, in that there is that sense of the burden of expectation with Overlord? Okay, you and I and James, we'd all agree that the chances of Overlord failing are really quite minimal, but the world is watching, because it is perceived as being this critical, massive, great turning point that if it doesn't work, that's it, we're screwed. The landings in the south of France don't have that. It's all hanging on this. Does that give, like, the commanders, like Daniel, kind of that a little bit of not a free hand, but it means that the world isn't watching? There isn't likely to be an opposition that you can't deal with. Is that an advantage for a commander to go into something with that? It's not unimportant, but it's not you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think so. I think it takes some of the pressure off, but I think also conversely, when you see Churchill there, you get a sense that it's not unimportant either, and that you're remembered and that you matter. And I think pretty much every soldier who's going ashore on August 15th understands that we've got all the percentages on our side, that we're probably going to get ashore and all that. But I have to say, I think that's kind of small comfort, because Many of them don't know if they're going to be alive the next day because that unknown about what they're going to encounter when they get ashore. And the fact that even though there's not that much German opposition, there's still mines out there, and that leads to loss of life. You've got, quite a few wounded stacking up on the invasion beaches in the Third ID area. I mean, so there's always, from the combat soldier's perspective, that incredible nervousness. And by now we have our invasion day traditions of the steak and eggs and all that, the fattening up for the kill jokes and so we're all very used to this. And in the case of the Third ID, they've also rehearsed for this because they had fought very hard at Anzio and then to take Rome. And then, unlike some of their other comrades in Italy, they're going to be taken off the line in the latter part of the summer 1944 to prepare for this. So there is, I think, this sense of anticipation. I think there's a hope on the part of many of the commanders that this will be a knockout blow kind of operation to take down the Germans, not just in France, but to take down the Germans altogether too. There's that word hope again as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's look at objectives. Let's look at the end game of this, because we were chatting before going live. Is that the link up between forces from the south and forces from the northwest happens sort of towards the middle of September 10th or 11th or something like that. But had that been part of the original thinking? I mean, you've got to destroy the Italian units down there, the German units there. You're getting into all sorts of different terrain, which when I get into later, it's not called the French Alps that reason for no reason. You've got your vineyards, you've got lots of rivers to cross, you've got urban warfare. So if we talk about Montgomery not being entirely clear about what the phase lines were for Normandy, with all that preparation, all that study, all that the transportation plan, knowing or having any idea about where you're going to get to from August from the south of France, was it a matter of just kind of let's get as far as we can, or had they got any kind of idea of timetables and objectives?
I think it's more let's get as far as we can. The other thing that's a little bit more in play here than we had in Normandy is certainly a kind of standard uniform French military presence that's going to be in play here as well. So we've got to work that out, how U.S. 7th Army and French 1st Army are going to fight together, how they're going to coordinate objectives and all that. And so I think that affects like the phase line mentality versus we're building up in England for 2 years and we can figure out, how we're going to phase line across Normandy or wherever. This is a little bit different dynamic, I think. And I think also we have a sense, too, by the time we launch this invasion, that the situation is going to be pretty fluid because of what has happened in Normandy. Yeah. And so I don't know that like Patch as the 7th Army commander and then his boss, Jacob Devers, really wants to kind of confine themselves to the idea of phase lines. And really what they hope for is an open, dashing, slashing, mobile campaign, which is more or less what they're going to get, which is why we tend to think of this as a walkover. I would say it's not. It's certainly not from a soldier's perspective a walkover, but from a strategic point of view, it is a disaster for the Germans. It really is on many levels because it inflicts hammer blows upon what remains of their armies in that part of France. It persuades Hitler to finally evacuate France, which he had been stubbornly adhering, insisting they not do, because remember, the whole Mortain thing happens just a few days before this. And, when he's basically put his head in a noose in Normandy, right? And then you've got the whole Paris drama playing out over this next 10 days or so after we launch this invasion. It's definitely affected by this invasion, so we also have, as we're advancing, both French and U.S. troops, you've got the Maquis. And, these are more of the kind of better armed militia guerrillas, resistance fighters, which we even use that different term than often like French resistance standard kind of thing. Whereas that's where you would have had that more in northern France versus now in southern France. Politically, they represent different things for the French too. Certainly more of a leftward bent to the Maquis than some other French resistance groups or whatever. And so we've got all that in play here. And so I think that the expectation is this is going to be a quicker and more fluid campaign. And, fortunately that proves to be true.
Well, that's a perfect opportunity to ask you about the relationship with the French, because James Borhill was on last week and he did his great book about the Provence campaign and deciding which of the massacres and reprisals against the locals, against the resistance, against various kind of French Maquis units, which ones to include. They ended up including them all, but it did kind of be a bit depressing because there was a lot of loss of life down there. There was a lot of reprisals carried out, and as you said there, the French are participating in two ways. There's that absolute military army landing on the coast alongside America. Then there's this slightly not unpredictable response from the resistance, or the Maquis, as you say there, because the resistance up in Normandy was very much, everything that happened there was under the direct supervision of the Allies, wasn't it? We didn't encourage big resistance networks there. It's not the kind of place, there aren't big forests and mountains to hide resistance units in. So they were always there as part of the intelligence element, really. And there are a couple of, there are more than a couple. There are instances of French resistance being shot in Normandy, but mercifully it was a few dozen here and there, as opposed to the hundreds you get in the south of France. So let's deal with the military presence first, because at the same time, you just mentioned the Paris and the Normandy. There's this big, French Second Armored, de Gaulle, Leclerc going for Paris. Bradley doesn't want to. Eisenhower doesn't want to. We talk about that strain on the French-US relationship, with Britain kind of sort of almost sitting that one out. But in the south of France, the relationship between the US and Americans in terms of that military, it was pretty harmonious, wasn't it?
For the most part, it was. I mean, so we've worked with these guys in France, so there's already some of those relationships with the uniform French military units that are going to be in play. And I think there's really excellent coordination, honestly, when you think about how the French are going to move very quickly on Toulon, on Marseille. I mean, those are big gets. And I think that certainly the French deserve a lot of credit for that. But also I think that the coordination at the command level between the French divisions and the U.S. divisions, I think is really quite good in terms of you go there, I'll go there, go in different directions, versus the French Second Armored, which is kind of doing its own thing once Paris comes into the equation, and this is a point of frustration. Understandably, yeah, absolutely, yeah, that's right. And so what is a little different, though, the Maquis and the whatever we're calling them, whoever the guerrillas are, they are not under our control on any level, in a way. And so this is, I think it's really easy for Americans to forget this. This is something I emphasize to this day. We really have to remember we are in the middle of a civil war here once we hit the shores. And I think especially we see that in South France, that real tension between whoever has been part of the resistance, whoever is perceived to be a collaborator, or in between, or whatever. These have been really tough moral choices that people have had to make. And of course, the people in South France have not been occupied as long as the people in other portions of France. So you have that part of it, and the Vichy thing, and whether they're going to, adhere to de Gaulle's authority, who's doing what at the village level, and the reprisal thing. I mean, and the Germans, I think, understand this too, and it's one of the reasons why they're so heavy-handed and bloodthirsty almost in the way they're going to deal with any pushback resistance in South France. So from a U.S. soldier's perspective, there's very little understanding of that, I think. And because we're as always fixated on our kind of kinetic fight and objectives.
Yep.
And you can understand why. That's why we're there, really. But this political subplot ultimately is the purpose of all this. And so we're kind of seeing that on the margins. If I'm O'Daniel and below, though, fortunately, I don't have to deal with that quite as much, because I can, continue advancing where they're telling me to go, which is generally going to be northward. Up that Rhone Valley, that's where we're going. And then we hope to turn right. The link up, to me, we don't know that much about it because it's a little anticlimactic. We've collapsed their armies except for the Colmar pocket on French soil. The war has moved on to Luxembourg, to obviously to the Netherlands, to Belgium, to Western Germany. This then isn't quite as significant as going in and finishing this thing if we can. And that's what everybody is hoping for, obviously, as we get into September, but is becoming less likely by the day because of our logistics and because of the resilience of the Germans, too. I think we should also mention that as well.
Yeah. I'm glad you talked about that aspect of it, of the French situation not being necessarily something the Americans are aware of. I mean, and beyond that, you have not just within France, you've got the fact that the French army units are dealing with their own issues of race and colonialism and empire, but they're managing to kind of keep that within their own. It's a problem for them. They're not letting that kind of spread out to their allied neighbors, which I suppose is the same kind of thing the Brits and the Commonwealth were doing, is they weren't letting their kind of issues in perhaps North Africa kind of affect working alongside you guys. It was like, yeah, we don't understand it ourselves. We're not going to give it to you to worry about because it's our own problem. And we're hoping to have Antoine, one of our French guests, come on and talk about that French involvement there. But just a couple of questions that came in, I think are worth talking about in that general sort of support of the landing. So Samuel was asking about, was there carrier aviation supporting the breakout from the south of France? I mean, you've got air support is coming in from ground bases, but were there carriers in that area?
I don't think there's no fleet carriers. If there are, they're escort carriers.
Yeah,
they're
probably
a little escort one. Sub-duty anyway. So I really think it's 12th Air Force that has the more significant role, I guess, if I'll call it that.
Potent, perhaps. Yeah.
And the air support is quite good, because obviously we all know that you really don't want your major fleet carriers anywhere near, this much land, because they're going to be incredibly vulnerable, even by the Germans at this point when they've been largely swept from the skies. It doesn't take much to send one or two planes out there and get lucky against a major carrier, or eventually once you've got the V2s in play, which they will be by September. I mean, who knows? So you don't know, as we do, that they've got most of them deployed farther to the north where we don't have carriers anywhere nearby. But, so the most of our close air support is going to be ground based. And of course, again, too, once we get ashore and begin to advance farther north, we're going to do the same thing that we've done in the other portions of France, which is build airfields very quickly, primarily for fighters and maybe, medium bombers or whatever. But you'll have that kind of leapfrog where you can have your close air support go with you. And by now, of course, we've got I think it's so interesting. We've got forward air controllers who are embedded with ground units, many of whom are actual pilots, and are going to be in communication with the guys above. And so I've often said that, here, but also, in Normandy and beyond, we are seeing the United States Army as it was designed to be, in this war, reflecting our society as a very automated, aviation-oriented, firepower-oriented, maneuver warfare kind of approach to conflict. And I think you really see this come to fruition. You see what an incredibly dangerous animal the U.S. Army had become by this point in time. The Germans are so on the wrong end of that. And in South France, we have a miniature version of what we've seen in North France at that point, in the late summer, I'm saying.
That's a really good point about the American army is kind of becoming like the British Army of 1918, or indeed the Americans are there as well, that kind of professional, but sometimes maybe wasn't used in the right way. Hergen Forrest, I'm looking in your direction later on, but that's another subject for the day. But could you talk about the importance of these roads, and the plan is basically head north until you can't go north anymore. You talk about Davos at the top there, but Robert is asking about, with his experience with armored forces, was there not a kind of question of bringing some more armor in terms of divisions down there? I mean, you got a lot of armor still coming through normally, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, the 6th. I mean, I know we have all the independent unit battalions and things, which is a slightly different kettle of fish there, but not an argument to put some decent, fast-moving divisions down there.
I mean, he'd love it. It's a matter of priority and sway. And as I think we all know, Devers and Eisenhower did not get along particularly well. We all know who was more wired in with George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, certainly Eisenhower. Devers was already a little bit frustrated on some levels with, dealing with Mark Clark in Italy. And, so he's got some set twos that he's in the middle of. So it's going to be farther down the line chronologically until he can start to get any semblance of armor divisions coming through into his ballywhack. And it, as Woody, as you said, we've already landed several others in the north. But also too, I think it's fair to say that these infantry divisions have a pretty good amount of mobility. They're not mech infantry, but they're not too far from that. They have a heck of a lot of trucking. Okay, admittedly, they don't have half track, so that's different. But the trucking, when you're talking about a campaign this mobile against an enemy on the run, the trucking achieves something of the same purpose. And any infantry division has got our M7 priests, which that's really good self-propelled firepower, in addition to the planes. So if we're thinking about like the bigger perspective of do we give Devers what he wants as a decision maker, you could justify it and say, well, I don't know that he needs that just yet. I don't know that we can really, and the shipping, of course, dictates everything of where we can send an armor division, where we can't. So I do think that there's some level of justification why he's not maybe going to get as much armor as he wants to. And of course, the argument at the time too is you're not facing much German armor, right? So, so I mean that's of course obviously beyond any dispute. So that's eventually how this shakes out. But I'd be fair to say that Devers probably wanted more armor, and in that he wouldn't have been unique.
Yeah, no, well, who doesn't like a few tanks? As Oddball says, it gives you a nice edge. But David O'Keefe is asking about, you talked about the US, the GIs not being aware of the complications of Vichy and the French and the factions and things. But were there civil affairs units attached to this force? I mean, that's the kind of area that the Allies have got the ability to have these specialist non-combatant teams to do these kind of things, like the assessment of vehicle repairs. That's the kind of stuff the Germans just do not have now. Anybody who can carry a rifle is carrying a rifle. The Allies have got this ability to have people who are just good at improving the efficiency of hospitals, for example. So they have got the civil affairs people with them.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, so I probably should have made it more clear earlier who I was referring to. I'm talking about like in the rifle companies.
Yeah, exactly.
If I'm a BAR man, in one of the regiments or something, I mean, my level of local knowledge probably ends with Champagne, Champagne comes from here or something, so yeah, there's absolutely civil affairs units. In fact, part of any division, we of course have the counterintelligence corps units, which are sort of civil affairs-ish, but also have the more intel gathering mission. In any S1 or G1 section, or 5, sorry, S5 or G5 section, we've got civil affairs specialists, and of course, pretty decent number of French speakers and all that. The question is how much reach they have, and how much awareness the average soldier has of this. So yeah, they are absolutely doing their thing, these specialists, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's as smooth as it is. Yeah, they're figuring out who the locals are, the local authorities, who's the mayor, who's the local resistance leader. We've got all that happening, but it tends to be at the sort of farther away from the soldier experience. And so if we happen to be in a rifle company, are we really affected by that, or is it more like you happen to speak French, you're my company commander, I'm your one of your BAR guys, and I encounter somebody I can hardly communicate with, and you happen to be there, and then we liaison and coordinate with somebody, or we're figuring out, oh my gosh, there's a guerrilla unit in the woods that can help us here. Let's not have a fire mission on those woods. Maybe they can tell us where the Germans are, and maybe we can coordinate our actions. But this tends to happen a little more randomly than we would want, to be honest with you. If I'm talking about the real boots on the ground soldier, and in the great American tradition, seldom do we have guys who are really trained well culturally when they go in for their missions.
I've seen your tourists in Normandy.
Yeah, so you know what I mean.
I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but yeah. We Brits are terrible travelers as well, But
I think we got that from you.
Exactly. Yeah. You just learned that from us. Going around the world shouting in English and asking for sausages. That's the British way. But as much as this is a great conversation about the relationship between the French and all that, but I want to get to the dog faces, the GIs, because there's the typical photo that I used in the title as well. It's not an elephant in the room, but August in the south of France, it can be hot. It's dusty, and there's a hell of a lot of different types of terrain they're going to be facing over the next few weeks. You know, from pretty much Alps to the vineyards and olive groves and urban warfare, one village after the next, high ground, bridges, rivers. You know, that argument about pulling out a unit like the 3rd with all their experiences, there's nothing they're going to face in the south of France that they haven't faced elsewhere before. North Africa, they've done cold, they've done hot, they've done desert, they've done rocks, they've done forest, they've done. That's a really good argument for putting in a unit like that. Let's say they had put in the south of France one of those units that comes ashore sort of October, November, the units that kind of wind up in the Ardennes who haven't got any combat experience. You've got to go in and learn every type of terrain because you're going from one to the other almost on a sort of daily change basis. That was as much as it made this guy's life difficult over the next few weeks, that was a good unit to send in to have practical experience.
Definitely. Definitely. Absolutely. We fought in every kind of terrain you possibly could at this point, including a little bit of desert, but primarily, you know, amphibious, mountains. Boy, we've done plenty of that in in Italy. We've fought in low ground, like the Mussolini Canal around Anzio. We have fought in woodlands. I mean, you name it. So yeah, terrain-wise, we absolutely have this know-how, this kind of institutional know-how of where and how to fight. We have done the mobile thing, especially during the breakout from Anzio. We have fought on the fringes of major metropolitan areas, whether that was at Palermo or Messina or Rome or whatever. We fought in small towns. So, I mean, it is just one thing after another. And the way this campaign is going to be in August, at least, and maybe the first week or weekish of week and a half, maybe of September, it's going to be a pretty quick moving mobile kind of campaign. So the 3rd ID has a good grasp of maneuver warfare too. And in addition, you know, they're going to participate in what I often think of as a mini fillets, which is the fight at Montélimar. Which you know, basically pens in and traps a substantial portion of the German forces there and annihilates them. The 3rd isn't the only unit, of course, but I think they play the leading role for the most part. And among the 3rd ID, the 7th Infantry certainly does.
Yeah.
This is just an annihilation kind of battle, and so. It's the 3rd ID is very much a been there, done that kind of unit. And the weird thing, sobering thing, is that on some levels, like if you come ashore August 15th, on some levels, the war is just beginning for the division because you're going all the way to Berchtesgaden, with that division. And there's a lot of fighting that happens in between, for the rest of this war. We're just talking about what you would look back on if you survive long enough as a fond period of 3 weeks or so in which you're kicking the Germans' butts and you're on the move and the weather was pretty good. Yeah, it's warm, but you know what? You've possibly fought in Italy. And so, it's not much worse than any Italian heat that you might have had. I think you would have, looking at the campaign, I think a highlight for you as an American soldier in any of these divisions would have been the excitement of the population and the liberation scenes in various towns and all that would have been really, really exhilarating, as I think it was for a lot of these GIs.
Well, you see that. I mean, just as you said, there's one of those Life magazine photos there, and the gratitude there is clear in that photo. And we talked about the labeling. I mean, it hasn't come up yet. Well, you mentioned champagne, but you didn't kind of mention the champagne campaign moniker that this ended up getting. And I think most people watching this, they'll have heard of Marseille and St Tropez and the places on the beaches there because they're kind of world famous. But you mentioned Montélimar there. You start going in further inland, Belfort and places like that. They're not kind of the places you roll off the tongue, and yet most people would be aware of Salerno, Anzio, maybe not. Monte Cassino, of course. I mean, became a globally famous. The lack of not interest because we're interested in this, but the lack of kind of global appreciation for this is there aren't. It's not quite a slogging match of Italy, but it's lots of on the smaller side engagements that link together to kind of create a bigger one without those kind of cup finals. Is that kind of a fair assessment of kind of the August, early September?
Yeah, it doesn't have that all or nothing drama of Normandy, I guess. It doesn't have that terrible nightmarish World War One-ish slog of Italy, the way, like Casino especially. It doesn't quite have that. It has this kind of, well, it's not a fair fight, and we're clobbering these guys whiff to it. That leads to that term, the Champagne Campaign. And I knew many veterans of this particular campaign who hated that term because it created the idea that that's all they did is swill champagne. Now, there was probably some of that they're doing, but largely it's like anything else for an infantryman. You've got an objective today and you're hoping you survive till tomorrow, and they don't know how this is going to turn out. For all they know, the Germans are going to turn and fight back, whatever. So in the meantime, they're just enjoying as best they can when they encounter people like we see in this image here. When they encounter this friendliness, or they can hook up with women, or whatever else. Nothing new about any of that, right? So yeah, I think it doesn't persist in our popular memory because a lot had happened before and a lot was about to happen. Market Garden, of course, is going to suck the oxygen out of the room, and then of course we did the bulge and all that, So I totally get why. And of course, the Normandy invasion had happened, and everything else seems anticlimactic from the big picture lens of history. So, yeah, I mean, it's like anything. Perhaps it does get lost in the shuffle a little bit, but I think the deeper we delve into it, the more we see, how important it was, and also how difficult it was, I think, depending on where we're talking about on any given day, at least from a 3rd Division perspective. I mean, it just seemed like this division was always in the middle of the fights, the heavy fights. I mean, wherever they went, they were gaining ground, and they just seemed to run into pretty tough resistance that they just would end up clobbering on some level. But boy, they paid a price for it. And you definitely see that in South France too. It's no different than anywhere else.
Well, it's in a sense they're the victims of their own proficiency. That if there'd been a division land down there like the poor old 90th in Normandy, who were being examined for their lack of performance, with that comes attention. If you're just doing your job very well and pushing up, then everyone just kind of leaves you alone and lets you get on with it. And I sense there's an element of that about the 3rd and the 45th down there, is that they're being professional, they're getting the job done. There's no real problems they face that they don't surmount pretty effectively. Sure, there's casualties, sure there's dilemmas, but they kind of solve them in house. And I suppose, and I was just going to think, as you said about the champagne there, maybe that's the US equivalent of the British stopping for tea, is that when you weren't fighting, you had champagne, but you weren't having champagne instead of fighting. It's the British, when we're stopped, the British have tea, but we don't stop for tea in the middle of a battle. But if you wouldn't mind, kind of sum up kind of the 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks from the 15th to the end of August. There's pushing northwards there, and there's a whole lot of series of maps that I've got here that you can find online in the standard green books. But is it more or less just a continuing north? I mean, and just rivers and towns and rivers and towns and hills?
One town after another, a mobile campaign, probably on the move each day. Just a new objective to take each day. Maybe no resistance today, maybe resistance tomorrow. A slashing mobile campaign. The closer we are to the beach area, that first 2 to 3 days, yes, we've gotten ashore fairly easily, but there's a crust of resistance from a 3rd ID perspective that we have to overwhelm. And some of the heaviest fighting happens at a place called La Langue, where there's a key bridge that has to be taken. And, so you see some pretty sharp, heavy fighting that goes on there for this to happen. Then you collapse the crust of resistance, and then you got the next 8 miles or whatever, so it's kind of like that. The Germans, of course, are desperate, plugging people in to and fro, fleeing, but you can run into a fleeing German unit, and that could still be very, very dangerous. So that second half of August and into, as I said, the first week to a week and a half of September tends to be on the move. You're probably not digging in much. And I think Woody, I think you put it really well, that there's a difference between stopping for tea and brewing tea after you stop. I think the same deal with the champagne. And it's, there are parts of it that are fun. Like when you're in these villages and there's this people coming out and excited to see you and giving you food and welcoming you. And of course, again, let's not forget women. I mean, part of this too, the famous, American GI picking up on French women kind of thing. There's a heck of a lot of that going on. But, let's think of it from a logistician standpoint too. This is always a challenge as we're moving quickly to supply the division, to make sure there's enough trucking, to make sure the fuel situation is good and all this. And so I think that O'Daniel's division does exceptionally well in this. I'm not aware of any kind of major logistical shortfalls that we have in this whole 3 weeks or so. They get all the way to a town called Besançon, and you're going to see some pretty sharp fighting in the town. We still have the mobile campaign, but what's going to stop us as we get deeper into September is, of course, the Vosges Mountains, which is obviously a real barrier that's there anyway. And it doesn't take much for the Germans to scrape together what they've got and set up some defensive lines on the Vosges Mountains. And, of course, 7th Army and French First Army then are going to deal with that, just as, farther north, once you're approaching the Hurtgen Forest or whatever, you're running into some terrain issues there. So, but I think if we're thinking like the broad, third ID experience in World War II, this 3 to maybe 4 week period is really one of the highlights in the division's history.
Rather not as shit as the other bits, in that sense, but we've got quite a few questions about the German response, because, when you get to Italy, which we've talked about before, the hope that the Germans would do something isn't necessarily met by what the Germans actually do. The Germans were a bit torn in Italy about what they should do. So Representative swayed the questions we've got. David Levine is saying, what did the German High Command do as a strategy in southern France? What was the plan? Andreas is saying, how many units were transferred north to still help Normandy? And then did the Germans have units resting from the eastern front in the south of France? Did the Germans it said, were they moved? So the Germans sum up we as Brits and Americans, we often focus on what our guys were doing, and the Germans sometimes kind of end up in the writing being kind of the nameless enemy of Star Wars films. Have they got a strategic policy in place to defend, or is it a question of kind of just falling back in a random way, or a bit of both?
That's why I kind of chuckled at that question. Any kind of grand strategy or policy by mid-August 1944 in South France is a bit out the window. 19th Army has been kind of stripped of a lot of its most valuable assets because of the greater crisis in the north, most notably the Das Reich division, that had traveled north to go make trouble, in Normandy or wherever. But it didn't mean that they're static assets that they still got there. The coastal defense divisions, the Aussie divisions, and even some mobile armored formations they have here and there. But plus they've got artillery. That didn't mean that it wouldn't pose some resistance. But from a German high command level, if you're looking at this from an OKW point of view, this is a hopeless situation. I mean, you are badly outclassed in terms of the quality of the units in play, the amount of firepower, and obviously air power and sea power available to your enemy. And so the best you can hope for, I think, by the time we're in mid-August or later, is to fight a delaying action that's going to slow them down and cause them casualties or whatever. That's your first impulse once the Allies come ashore. What you're eventually doing, with permission from Hitler, is just retreating and getting out of there to fight again another day. Now, if we're thinking well before the actual invasion and even the invasion of Normandy, someone asked, I think, is South France used as a rest area for units on the Eastern Front? Certainly for soldiers on the Eastern Front. Now that of course, we're generally talking post-Torch now. When the Germans are coming in and occupying much of what had been Vichy France. So we have to bear that in mind too. So yes, that would have been a nice place to be, but a lot had happened by even June 1944 when Normandy happens. And then 2 months later, 19th Army is just not in a good state. And so, if we're talking about the composition of the German armed forces too, many of them are not German. Right. Many of them are Aussies, they're Eastern Europeans, and they may or may not fight. I mean, who knows? Just think of yourself in that situation. And I'm glad we're covering this, because it's a hopeless circumstance, isn't it? You're Polish, you're Russian, Ukrainian. I don't know. Name another ethnic group from Eastern Europe, whatever. I mean, you're expected to fight by your German overseers. You don't necessarily want to fight these Allied soldiers, and the French aren't going to be too happy with you if they ever get their hands on you. The Americans aren't going to understand if you're shooting at them. They're going to be a little ticked off about that. And so what do you do? I mean, how do you get out of there? And then if you are fortunate enough to end up in an American POW cage, they may have to process you to go back home into the great clutches of Joseph Stalin, and he's not going to like you too much. So, or if you're Polish, you know, those who had fought on the Allied side in Poland aren't going to like you a whole lot. So again, the Civil War aspect of this too. So the Germans are dealing with that complicated personnel issue as well. And I think no more so than in South France, where they have these kind of hollow Eastern European dominated formations. We saw plenty of that in Normandy too, didn't we?
Yeah. And of course, the fact that there's maybe this sense that if you are a foreign national, whether you're from Poland, Ukraine, that there are possibly other options, because you've got Hungary, Romania looking at changing sides and doing deals. You've got Poland has started an uprising that we now know is going to fail, but it's showing that there are possibilities of just going along with the fact you've been told to do this because you've been a prisoner effectively of the Third Reich for the last 2 or 3 years, that maybe there's another way out of it. But yeah, that's another dimension that is really, really fascinating. But going back to the earlier campaigns, we're talking about the change of terrain and urban warfare, and I'm in my understanding that they're kind of looking at the situation as they go along. Which is the village that's got the bridge that works? Where does the opposition? And they're kind of, although they're basically heading north, they can be kind of flexible in there. It doesn't have to be this town or that town. It's like which is the best way through. But there's that kind of the elephant in the room is you have to get to that area between the Alps and like the Vercors, and you get to the Rhone and the Loire, where you get these routes north that the Romans were using 2 millennia earlier. And as you were saying there, as the Germans are falling back, maybe in some disarray, they must have been kind of looking at that, well, we've got some really good ground to defend there, because whichever way the Americans have been using to get here, they're going to have to come through these passes later on. So is it kind of early September and mid-September where the situation changes a bit, and you're getting towards Germany, you're getting towards this? Is that kind of a changeover period?
It is. Then the closer we get to Germany, the heavier the resistance becomes, the tougher the terrain, because now we're plunging into the Vosges. Now also too, we're getting transportation and logistical problems because we're very far away from the invasion beaches and even the port cities in South France. And so this is just a greater challenge. And so this is really a microcosm of what Eisenhower's armies are dealing with overall. Farther to the north, it's the same kind of pattern. The Germans have more or less salvaged whatever they can to get whoever they can out of France, and are setting up along their western frontier. And so you're going to experience that as a 3rd ID soldier, as anybody in 7th Army or French 1st Army, whatever. You've got that situation in front of you. And of course, oh, by the way, the weather's getting worse. As we're getting to the latter part of September, it's starting to get a little cloudy, a little rainy. The days are shorter. So you have all those challenges in front of you. And that's what I say. I think that's why, looking back on it, especially from the point of view, like later on in November 1944, as a 7th Infantry cotton baler soldier, if I'm part of the Meurthe River crossing, which is one heck of a fight, I'm looking back pretty fondly on August and on the days when it was sunny and reasonably warm, and I was going from village to village, being greeted as a great liberator. Whereas now I'm in a grim struggle in a heavily forested area, which really isn't all that different than the Hurtgen forest, topographically or whatever, though it's much better led and conceived, but still, it's an incredibly tough fight. So things have gotten grim, just like they have for the rest of the Allied armies. And that's a good map we're looking at here, is you can just kind of see it's just this continuous front. Nothing terribly glamorous about it, and we have by now the disappointment set in that everyone realizes we're looking at another winter of war. And so we've got our little end of it here, somewhere in the Vosges, where we're fighting just like everybody else is on and up and down that line.
Which brings us to kind of where we're going to be kind of bring this to an end, is that Normandy at least has a fairly certain end game. Yes, there's fighting in Le Havre till September, but the gap gets closed. Paris gets liberated within 4 or 5 days. That kind of, it turns the page. There's now a new campaign on. We're pressing to Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany now, and it's like that's an obvious end to the Normandy campaign. The southern France campaign just sort of morphs into the West Wall, the Vosges, the Siegfried line. It doesn't. It's like when the Germans in 1940 go from the Battle of Britain to the Blitz. You know, the British maybe see a kind of a clear, that's one phase, but the Germans, it morphs. So does this campaign end or does it change? What's your assessment? I mean, that map there is really good, and we mustn't, you know, the fact that date there, that again, same time, it's Market Garden, it's everything else happening. It's difficult to kind of pin down when it all really reaches a conclusion. I mean, it doesn't, I suppose.
It really doesn't. It peters out, like you said. It morphs. It's a perfect word. It transitions from an amphibious invasion and its aftermath to a campaign of pursuit.
Yeah.
Into just the sort of incremental eastward slog that we've got up and down the line elsewhere in the Allied armies. And what day that happens, I mean, I think it just depends what unit we're talking about. I mean, but it's certainly, the latter, by pretty deep into September, this transition has happened. So yeah, it doesn't have that triumphant narrative of Normandy, where, you've had the breakout and then you've got Falaise. And of course, we still argue this day about when Normandy really ends. So, there's that. But it doesn't have that kind of incredible sort of dramatic buildup of Normandy and this great release of finally, winning and having the breakout. This was a breakout from the beginning on some levels. And so it creates that expectation that it'll lead to some sort of ultimate result of overall victory in the war. Certainly it contributes to that, but of course, it's not going to lead to immediate victory. So what you've got in front of you, if you're one of these Third ID soldiers, I mean, you're fighting the rest of the fall in the Vosges, and eventually you're going to get Strasbourg. Unfortunately, it's not a building to building kind of fight there, but you're going to fight in the Colmar pocket, which I think we'd all agree is one of the worst campaigns of the entire war in the West. And then you're going to fight in the Rhineland, in the Siegfried line, and by the way, Nuremberg. And I think we forget that this is urban combat. I mean, an incredibly sharp end kind of level by April 1945. So, let's say you survived into September. Again, the war is kind of just beginning for you on some levels. It's a little depressing from that standpoint, and not that different than Italy, I suppose. Yeah. And then it's just a kind of bludgeon fest to take these guys down over the next month in any way you possibly can.
So one of the things I was going to ask earlier, but I didn't earlier, but I'll do it now. And I've asked Kevin Hemel this, and I've asked Roger Cirillo this, is that it seems to me fairly unique American thing of shuffling up your corps. Divisions get shifted from one corps to another. Corps go from an army to an army. And we Brit and Canadians, we kind of do that when a division has been broken. You have to replace it. So when one comes in, but really that seems to be a fairly unique American thing. What benefits and downsides of that? And then later on, I'll ask you about the phasing of the absolutely green division, because that kind of comes into the Hurtgen and the Ardennes later on, which starts to happen in the Vosges as well, isn't it? But let's deal with this kind of core shuffling thing. Where does that come from? What's the rationale behind it?
So you have the idea that you're going to keep units on the line as much as you possibly can and replace people individually. You've already got that in place. And I think American commanders, not just in the European theater, but also we see this in the Pacific at times too, are almost obsessed with like unit boundaries. Where our boundary ends and yours begins. And I think part of that is the control of the firepower we've got and making sure there isn't chaos there. I think this naturally morphs over into saying, okay, well, we've already got that arrangement. So we can just more easily transfer your corps to this army command like that, or this division to corps command without rearranging anything else in terms of proximity. We'll just change the levels of responsibility and organization. And it happens with dizzying frequency. It can be really frustrating because You look at, like when you're thinking about this administratively and you're trying to research, say a unit in combat, like a division in combat, and you want to cover all the sources. You're like, wait a minute, we can look at the division sources, but they were part of 19th Corps for that week, and then they were part of 20 Corps the next week, and so you're like, okay,
I'm in that position right now with the Haida-Pui and 8th Corps,
and frustrating.
It gets so annoying,
It is. It's ridiculous, and so this brings into play a lot of other dimensions. But I think at the time, they thought of it as preferable to this big sort of, no, you stay part of 5th Corps for the entire war, and there will be no divergence from that. They felt that it created a level of flexibility. So I think it made a little sense on that level, but also it did lead to some level of confusion and boundary issues at times, and whatever else.
Historians being confused doesn't really matter. We're not delaying the end of the war by scratching our head when we're doing it. But even like back into Brittany, which we've been talking about, so when the 83rd Division were part of the attack on San Malo, that was a regimental combat team. But for Brest, it's task forces. Like, what is I understand there is a difference, but it's like, can't you just have a unified, when you're doing a special plan, just always call it a task force or something? Why? It's interesting, and it doesn't really matter, but it just does. I wonder, because whether at this point in the war, you've got so many tools, so many toys in the toy box, you can have the luxury of renaming, and because why not? We can, I suppose, but
right.
I just find it interesting that there is this kind of shuffling, and it kind of makes sense if you're putting the right assets in the right place, but it does make it confusing. But the second part, as I say, is about the phasing in of the green divisions. I mean, we know about its impact on the Ardennes. That's been talked about, and I think maybe talked about too much, but it's not just the Ardennes it's happening, is it? It's happening right across this, it ties in with the whole Eisenhower broad front thing of keeping that pressure on, is that, and this, how the 3rd have been in the line a long time, the 29th up from the north. How else do you do it? What? If putting in green units and taking the well-experienced ones out of line is not the right thing, what's the alternative?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, there's no good alternative, because as you're taking losses, you may have to take really good formations out of the line for any given amount of time, and certainly this happens plenty. But I do think it does make more sense to try and keep them on the line as much as possible when you're talking about large continental littoral operations. The broad front strategy of facing an enemy that you can overwhelm as a result of your advantages. And so you have this rite of passage in the U.S. Army of green units coming into the line, or maybe more commonly, green soldiers individually coming onto the line and having to figure out what's what. I think one of the great myths of the World War II U.S. Army is that these replacements were reviled, not welcome, that they weren't useful. I think the movie The Big Red One creates that notion a lot, that we won the war with 4 riflemen kind of thing who stayed in service somehow for 3 years.
We will have no bashing of Lee Marvin here, sir, but yes, no, I'm with you.
Well, and I love Lee Marvin, but perhaps it's Samuel Fuller I'm taking to task in a way, in a friendly way, in a friendly, jibing way. But in reality, statistically speaking, the majority joined their units as replacements. There were surveys in the Mediterranean theater that found at least 2/3 had not come overseas with their unit. And I don't think we saw any kind of massive diminution of the efficacy of our units or whatever. So I think though the replacement process was kind of cruel and impersonal on some levels, I do think that it had some things to recommend it. I think ultimately at least worked well enough.
Yeah.
And I think when we're talking about sending entirely new divisions into combat, we were going to have to do that anyway, weren't we? I mean, that's just war.
Yeah, no, it's going to happen. I mean, I suppose you could do where you take a division with its 3 regiments and say, we're going to take 1 regiment out and put a new regiment in from a new division, but then you're losing all that. Hey, but this division's got a connection with Kansas. We're the National Guard guys from the new, and that. As a Brit, I would oppose that within British units, although of course all our British units are full up with people from all over the country. But there's always that core identity that I think is is that immeasurable quality when you're writing about units in the Pacific you've done, that you can go, okay, they've got this number of tanks, they've got this number of that, but this pluck measurement, the spirit, tradition, they're really hard to quantify, but yet they are clearly important on the battlefield.
I think, fortunately, that is where they drew the line. That once you reach the division level, like below division level, they didn't shuffle regiments in and out. I'm really glad they didn't do that, and I think that's why, because you know, like we're talking the third ID, you knew you were a dog-faced soldier, that you were part of that identity. You had the patch and everything. I mean, that really did matter. Whereas Corps and Army were much more abstract. You know, even as a captain or maybe even a lieutenant colonel, you might have been hard pressed to name your Corps commander or even your Army commander. You know, Patton's real famous now and everything, but would you have really known that you were fighting under Third Army auspices on any?
I think that's I was gonna say Third Army is probably the only one where I've met veterans who would say, I'm a Third Army. Now maybe they were kind of
but you know what interesting is to see whether they said that before 1970
that's
when the
true.
Patton movie came out, because then after that everybody was part of Patton's army to this day. I mean, I hear, oh, my forebear was with Patton at such and such. I'm like, well, where, what? And you know, so I think he does stand out in a way, but I wonder about, like, in 1944, would you have had that consciousness of saying, okay, I'm part of the 6th Armored Division and we're with Patton's Third Army right now? I don't know. I mean, I think that in most cases you were lucky to identify your division commander, and you know, and certainly Corps commanders a lot of times were more anonymous. They're in that halfway house in between.
So, talking of people you would know, we've been asked for your views on Audie Murphy. You know, I mean, you know, it's we've talked about it before with you. Third ID provided ridiculous number of Medal of Honors and DSCs and Silver Stars throughout the division. Purple Hearts, they're in there. They beat records on a statistical level pretty much in every regard. Audie Murphy, is it a good thing for the history? Is it too much focus on one guy? I mean, where are you on the whole Audie Murphy legend of?
I mean, you know, Audie Murphy is the ultimate, you know, and I on some levels, and I think Audie Murphy is so fascinating. I mean, so interesting and so much what we like to think of ourselves.
He's an ideal, isn't he? Yeah,
he is, like this humble dude that no one expects much of, you know, reared in poverty and all these disadvantages, and he finds out in a system of merit and in the hard knocks of war who he really is. I think that's so appealing, and I think there's some level of truth to that, you know. But if Audie Murphy happened to be born with black skin, he wouldn't have had the same kind of opportunities or whatever. We have to take that into account too. But, you know, it was what it was then in this respect. He got the opportunity he had, and he showed who he really was. He also, I think, had the ability to communicate his experiences that stands out from many others who were really, honestly, on par with him in terms of valor within the division. So what I mean by that is his ability to write. I mean, To Hell and Back is a pretty darn good memoir. And then obviously his acting career and all that, he really does stand out for his ability to connect with the average American and beyond. And I think in that sense, he represents the spirit of the Third ID as the best we'd like to think of it. And I also just think it's worth to remember his accomplishments. I mean, it's incredible. So I'm a huge fan of Audie Murphy on so many levels. So I have no problem with him as this kind of symbol. But I also think in some cases it gets people interested to investigate the Third ID as a whole and others who also were, you know, really equally valorous, to be honest.
Yeah. And that, I guess that introspection that he went through was in a sense what killed him, isn't it? He could have tried to just kind of bury the whole thing in a box and throw it away, as so many vets did. And some people went through that process. You know, Louis Zamperini, I don't know, of introspection, that ended up being the best thing that they did. It maybe have taken them decades, but they came out of the other side of that tunnel in a better place. Audie, I guess, opened up that Pandora's box of why was I fighting, what was going on, what was it like dealing with the death of my friends, and it ultimately killed him. I mean, I suppose. I mean, that's not being too dramatic, is it?
Well, I think it really affected him emotionally and psychologically. Yeah. I wish he had lived so that we'd see, what could have been available beyond, and whether he could come out on the other side or whatever is, I mean, Woody Williams he might have gone through a lot of the same kind of thing, in his experiences on Iwo Jima and all the rest. He was also an exceptional communicator, but he lived into his 90s. And so we saw him in that larger kind of symbolic role, as beyond the demons on some levels. You're never really, but you know what I'm saying, that you could at least represent that. Audie's killed in 1971 as a reasonably young man in the plane crash. So we'll never know for sure. He also embraces celebrity in an odd level.
Yeah.
That's unusual.
I mean, he going to Hollywood probably would have felt like the dream, but as we know from what's going on in the news right now, the Hollywood dream isn't always the success in the music. Hollywood is not always what you want. It's a viper's nest of its own PTSD and problems and things. And so maybe if Audie had just gone back and just worked on his farm and carried on, he wouldn't. It's an interesting one to talk about. But for me as a Brit, he kind of represents that figure from literature. He's Luke Skywalker. He's Arthur and the Sword in the Stone. He's the small weakling that overcomes adversity, that becomes. This is what literature is based on. This is it's a standard story of kind of not redemption, but young boy finding himself in adversity and becoming someone that is beloved. And so it's a classic story. But
he's David who becomes Goliath.
Yeah, exactly. And yet, it's like all of these things, like Band of Brothers, like Masters of the Air, it's that one figure that brings people in, but it can, if you're one of the other Medal of Honor recipients that, Alex Kershaw's written about, perhaps you might have felt a little bit, hang on, it's bloody Murphy again is in the headlines, but that's, Murphy doesn't decide who, the hero doesn't decide what the public do with that hero. But we must bring things to the end, because although as much as I'm loving it, what would be a kind of a summary of the whole south of France in terms of the GI's point of view? I mean, does it deserve more study? Is it something we don't really understand a bit? Is the fact it ends up in the Colmar pocket and that kind of forgotten? How would you sum it up?
I think personally, even though I understand the opposition to it, I think in the end the invasion had to happen and should happen, and really because of logistics as much as anything. I think from the soldiers' point of view, especially the third ID, they would see it as a highlight in an otherwise terrible, grinding, mundane war. As Alex has pointed out, I think so eloquently, on any second, any hour, any given day, it could have been your last, and you just don't know otherwise. And not that that's just the third ID, but I think they give you as much a sense of that as anybody. So I do think it's a highlight. It's a successful kind of coup de main in amphibious operation. It's our last in the European theater in World War II. So it's a bit of a capstone. And I do think that it contributes to the defeat of Germany. It certainly contributes to the liberation of France. Yeah. Obviously for its own success, but because it persuades Hitler to finally pull the plug on France and get his people out of there so much as he possibly can. So I think it has implications for Paris and the way that story plays out, which could have ended up in a much worse place, as we all know. So, no, I do think I would like to see it better known, I guess, although I always stop short of saying people ought to know this or they ought to know. There's so much. Yeah. We're World War II historians, and we don't know half this, and we're constantly so I get that. I just hope that, as we cover it more like this and in other forums, maybe it'll just become a little bit more on our radar, in our consciousness, because I do think it's important. And I think it is a success story, at least to a certain point.
I'm going to be a bit trite here. And, you like your football. I mean, European soccer, I hate that word, but it's like, you're trying to pick 5 games to give the highlights of on a Sunday night. And as we said right at the beginning of this, there's a shit lot happening in August and September. And there's things that bring up really deep conversations. I mean, Antwerp being the big, huge elephant in the room there, Market Garden, the loss of a British airborne division there. Later in October, the Hurtgen, the folly of why we were there. This, at its heart, is a campaign that was solid. It did what it was supposed to do, pretty much. It didn't have any epic disasters. Neither did it have any epic, dramatic, kind of a Hollywood victories either. It was just steady. It's kind of you're the producer of the football highlight show. Well, we could put 10 minutes of this campaign in, but then we'd have to have less on. I feel it's kind of at that place. It's like it's really important, but it's not quite as dramatic as things happening elsewhere. I'm not even mentioning the Warsaw Uprising and things like that.
Right. Well, by the way, and Aachen too. Yeah, and so
Aachen, yeah.
You know what it is from a football highlights point of view? It's the favored team won its game 3-0, really solidly.
Yeah.
Okay, we're moving on to the next highlight. I mean, it's kind of like
a really good way of summing it up. Yeah. And in other news, third ID won their game as predicted.
As usual, right? Yeah.
Brilliant way of summing it up. But I will invite you back in later in the year to kind of talk about the next things we kind of touched on there, the later campaign, the decisions, the Scheldt, Antwerp. Everyone's got an opinion on that. We'll arrange ourselves that. But other than that, it's been, as people can tell in the sidebar, I just enjoy talking to you, and I think you enjoy talking to me. We could just keep on doing this till the cows come home. It's always a delight, John.
Absolutely, Woody. Me too. So much.
We'll do it again. So thanks, everybody. Buy my guest books. There's links to John's previous shows in the description below. He's written about the Pacific, written about my garden, written about everything pretty much. Go out there and buy the books. You can't go wrong. Click like and subscribe. Share what we're doing. And we'll see each other again in due course, John. Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend. I'll see you again. Bye.
See ya.